With this background, for the rest of this module, we will examine what I call traditional, that is, simple planning processes. I want to stress again that calling something simple does not denigrate its importance or that doing this planning is easy. One model applicable to simple contexts I like to use with my planning students is John Bryson's 10-step process. In its simplest form, it follows a logic model type sequential linear process. Bryson is a professor of planning and public affairs at the University of Minnesota and has written extensively about strategic planning. I also like Bryson because he concentrates on the governmental and nonprofit sectors, so people in public health will resonate with his language. We will deal with each step in detail, but to summarize, Bryson's process includes getting to agreement on the planning process itself, identifying what the organizational mandates are, clarifying organizational mission and values, conducting what we call a SWOT analysis, and identifying the strategic issues that the organization faces. Formulating strategies to manage issues, reviewing and adopting the strategies or a plan, and establish an effective organizational vision. However, as I will explain later, I like dealing with vision earlier in the process. Bryson ends his process with an effective implementation process and sums it all up with an evaluation component. This slide shows the graphical representation of a similar planning process outlined by Richard Lynch, another management professor from Great Britain. Lynch calls his process prescriptive, and that's what I call a traditional planning process. Again, like Bryson, this process is particularly well suited to simple contexts. You see that some of the steps and language are akin to Bryson's, and there are many other similar examples in the professional and popular strategic planning literature of the last 50 years. Back to Bryson. His first step is to agree on the process. As with everything else in strategic planning, there is no correct way of doing it, and there are books filled with the various ways of bringing people together to do planning, from very informal to very formal. This diagram comes from Linda Gratton, who says you can use top-down, bottom-up, or organizational learning strategies for your strategic planning process. Jim Collins, based on his research for his bestseller Good to Great, points out that organizational effectiveness is not dependent upon leadership style and the amount of stakeholder participation in the process. It seems that depending upon the organization, many different processes can work. In fact, I believe that the strategy creation process should be governed by whether the situation is simple, complicated, or complex. But again, that detailed discussion is more than we can accomplish in this module. What I wish to stress, however, is that many processes can result in a useful strategic plan. My own bias, based on my understanding of individual and organizational change, is that the more participation there is from key stakeholders, the more likely the planning process will be successful, with success being highly particular to the organization. However, broad participation in the planning process is no guarantee of success. Bryson's next step is understanding the organizational mandates for planning. These can be formal and informal. For example, I participated in planning processes that were mandated by federal law and regulation. As such, the processes, the methodologies, etc., were strictly defined by the regulators. I've also encountered CEOs of organizations who have said, "This is what strategic planning is, and this is the way we're going to do it, period." In other organizations in which I have worked, there's a long tradition of how planning is done that transcends leadership and is part of the organizational culture. It's important to be aware of all of these expectations. However, getting back to my earlier points, one can achieve shared understanding and agreement in an organization about how it's going to meet its future, regardless of, or even in spite of, the planning processes involved. The one caveat I do have, however, is that often people apply inappropriate, and in this case, the simple systems methodologies we are discussing here, to complicated and complex situations, thereby rendering their planning less effective. It is for this reason that I believe that oftentimes people will say, "We do all this planning and the plans end up sitting on the shelf." I will say more about this in a future module. The next step in the process, according to Bryson, is clarifying the mission and values. However, I prefer to deal with vision at this point as well, as I will explain shortly. Personally, I believe this is the most important step of the entire planning process. It forms what I call the philosophical base for everything else, and all subsequent discussions and actions hinge on these important concepts. In fact, some plans contain little more than mission, vision, and value statements. Parenthetically, I also happen to believe that the commonality in planning across simple, complicated, and complex contexts is mission, vision, and values. So what you learn here can be applied to any planning context. When talking about mission, vision, and values, it's important to recognize that this is another case where one person's mission will be another person's vision. There are whole books full of mission statements, vision statements, value statements, and other books dealing with how you construct them. So when I hear someone say, this is how you construct your mission statement, and this is what it means, I take it with a grain of salt. So an important rule of thumb when dealing in this area is always to define your terms and make sure everyone understands them. Both from my own experience and from reading the literature, again, there's no right way to do this. The importance, and I can't emphasize this enough, is that the participants in the process all have a shared understanding of what this means to them and their organizations. So let's start with my preferred definition of a mission statement. Most often you will see in the literature that mission is equated with purpose. That is to say, why does the organization exist? As Mark Lipton says, it should appeal to, and I would also add that it should be understood by, the broadest number of people affected by the process, i.e. the stakeholders of the organization or community. I define the vision statement as the foundation of the where do you want to go part of the cyclical planning process that we discussed earlier. Mark Lipton says that the vision paints a vivid picture for the organization, and though future-based, is written in the present tense as if it were being realized now. Starting with vision is akin to doing what is often suggested in the logic model evaluation process, starting with defining the end point, the impact you hope to have. Stephen Covey calls this starting with the end in mind as one of his 7 effective habits. Similarly, one of my mentors, George Land, defines the vision as the end point, what he calls either perfection or great success. The process of planning then becomes one of working backwards from perfect or backwards from great success. This has been termed backcasting as opposed to forecasting. One image I like to use in speaking of vision is to describe it as a beacon pulling one forward into the future. Think of it as a lighthouse guiding a ship in stormy seas as depicted in this painting. The basic idea is that if you have a beacon, regardless of how turbulent the environment becomes, you will always know which way you need to go, even if you have to move sideways or sometimes even backwards for a while because of stormy seas. Visions are intended to capture the imagination of planning participants. So I will often use a guided imagery exercise to create a vision, and I have also used storytelling techniques to engage participants in the process. Often you will hear pundits proclaim that vision statements should be short and sweet. However, they can be narratives several pages long. What is important is that the visioning process and subsequent vision statements help planning process participants imagine what could be a possible, positive future for their organization or community. This slide shows my understanding of the relationship between mission and vision. Simply put, I believe that mission pushes us into the future, while simultaneously vision pulls us into the positive future for our organizations or communities. Finally, the values part of what I call the philosophical base of the organization provides the guideposts for how we work together, how we serve our various stakeholders, including our communities, our patients, our customers, our clients. I would like to add another observation here. Oftentimes you will see mission, vision, and value statements framed in the introductory portion of a strategic plan, and we will look at a couple of examples in the next section. And/or they will be prominently displayed on the walls of the organization. I frequently hear the reaction, blah, 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 just a bunch of words on the page. As with the strategic planning document, the end product may appear bland or cliche-ish. However, the process of creating them is what may cause participants to catch fire with inspiration about what could be. This is another argument for including as many people as possible in the process. It also suggests that the mission, vision, and values need to be revisited frequently, not to change them, as they rarely change in an organization, but to refresh them. One way of accomplishing that and incorporating new employees into the organization is to tell the exemplar stories of how individuals or groups actually live the mission, vision, and values. Even more compelling are the testimonials from clients, patients, community members who were positively affected by what the organization or program did. The next step in the process that we were discussing is what is referred to as SWOT, or sometimes SWOC. SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and sometimes threats is replaced by the word challenges. This answers in large part the question, where are we now? One way of looking at the SWOT analysis is that the strengths and weaknesses are internal to the organization and deal with the past and the present, and opportunities and threats are external to the organization and focus on the future. I think that many strategic planning efforts fail or fall short because of the lack of what is termed environmental scanning. This involves really understanding what the external threats and opportunities are and what drives them. There are a couple of acronyms that have been used to describe the variables that should be included in a comprehensive analysis of the external environment. One way of thinking about them is to call them STEEP pests. STEEP stands for social, technological, environmental, economic, and political. Similarly, PEST stands for political, economic, social, and technological. You will see both referenced to in strategic planning literature. The point is that the context for strategy development is so important. There are lots of techniques for analyzing these variables, and a detailed discussion goes beyond this introduction. However, I think it's critical to understand the external environment of your organization because each of these STEEP factors and more may affect how you are able to fulfill your mission now and in the future. One thing to pay close attention to and to monitor over time is what are called weak signals. These are trends that may just be emerging and which may have a large impact on your organization. For example, one intersection of social and technological forces is the rise of social media. The term wasn't even around 5 years ago, and Facebook was a mere curiosity, yet no industry organization or community today is not affected by this rapidly changing technology. Accordingly, it's important to understand it and anticipate how it may influence you in the future, and there are dozens of similarly significant factors and trends. These days, particularly on the internet, there's lots of information from governmental and other sources about the STEEP pests. The CDC's Communities of Practice resource pages on the web, as shown in this slide, include some simple tips and guidance for developing a SWOT analysis. The next 3 steps in Bryson's model, and this is similar to the diagram developed by Lynch that we reviewed earlier, include the identification of strategic issues, the development of strategies, and reviewing and adopting those strategies. This is the how do we get there portion of the exercise. There are many processes to tease out from planning participants what the key strategies are, how to develop them, and the techniques for prioritizing and choosing among them. These include electronic decision support systems that are now on the market and can be very effective in helping groups to develop criteria and rank strategies accordingly. However, it's not necessary to have a very sophisticated technique. Again, the key is for participants in the planning process to agree on what is important and what to pursue. Here again, we have an instance of terminology confusion. Some people talk about strategies as goals. Others use goals and objectives interchangeably. Some people talk about the priority of goals over strategy. Again, the point is to make sure that everyone in the process understands what terms you are using and why. Here again, it is where a good program logic model, particularly in a simple context, can really help. As one example, this slide shows you the link to the CDC website where you can find tools to help you define objectives. As I described earlier, Bryson prefers to develop the organizational vision at this stage. However, I believe it's important to do this earlier on in the process. As I said before, each so-called expert, including me, has his or her preferences. In fairness, Bryson does acknowledge the reason why some people like me wish to address vision earlier. He thinks having a better understanding of the organizational environment, that is to say the SWOT analysis, and the strategic issues defined leads to a better vision statement. Regardless, you need to do what works for you and your organization. The ninth step in Bryson's process is figuring out the implementation. As I mentioned earlier, this can often be a cascading series of plans, that is to say, broad strategy then leads to much more specific implementation plans. Often these are program or business plans developed for individual units or programs within an organization, much as I described on the planning continuum slide. Finally, the 10th step in Bryson's process is to evaluate both the plan and the process and start the cycle all over again. So while the logic model describes this in a linear fashion, it is really a cyclical or spiral process where at this point you're answering the question, how well did we do? Again, I'm putting in a plug for learning more about evaluation from the Arizona Public Health Training Center. In the next section, we'll take a look at a couple of examples of strategic plans.